So good morning everyone. Today we are going to discuss about what is a servlet architecture and life cycle of a servlet. So what is the general thing that is happening between a client and a server? A client is there, a client sends a request and based on the request the server produces the response. This is the basic thing we are carrying out throughout our client server architecture. But here we are going to discuss about a unique feature called servlet. Servlet is nothing but it is a piece of Java code that is inside your server. This particular servlet is responsible for handling the client request and producing the response. So three main things are done by the servlet. First one is request handling. So a client, it sends a request. The servlet analyzes what kind of request it is. It handles the request and based on the request, it is processing the request. The servlet processes the request by fetching the data from the database. And finally, it is producing the response to the client. This is the three basic thing which is done by the servlet. Next one is servlet architecture. So this is the basic thing. The browser is the client. The client sends a HTTP request to the server and finally the server responds with a HTTP response. So what is the difference between normal request and HTTP request and normal response and HTTP response? So request is nothing but it occurs in any application. HTTP request is the request which follows certain web rules. Normal request differs from HTTP request because HTTP request it follows certain web rules. Like it should go with the message like get and post method should be included in a HTTP request. So it is mainly for used in our web relevant things. A HTTP request is followed. So the browser, that is the client, sends a HTTP request and the request passes to the server. A server contains a web container. So that particular web container, what it does is it receives the HTTP request from the client. It creates threads to handle the request. Thread is nothing but a lightweight process. So for each request of the client, a thread is created to handle the request and the container is responsible for forwarding the request to appropriate servlets. The web container contains multiple servlets and the web container it forwards the HTTP request to the appropriate servlet and the servlet it interacts with the database and it processes the response according to the appropriate request and finally the response is handed over to the server and that particular server sends back the HTTP response to the browser. This is the basic architecture of your servlet. So a client is there. A client is nothing but a web browser. A client sends a request to the a client sends a HTTP request to the server and the server, it is not it itself processing the request. It uses web container. A web container, it is a container of servlets. A web container forwards the HTTP request to the servlet and that particular servlet is responsible for handling the request, processing the request, fetching the relevant data from the database and finally send back the HTTP response to the web server. And web server is responsible for sending back the HTTP response to the browser. This is what happening inside our servlet. So these are all the points that we have discussed. A client is nothing but a web browser and it sends the request. It initiates the communication. And a web server, by using servlets, it handles the request. And a servlet container, these are all the things that is happening inside a servlet container. It receives the request, it creates a thread to handle the request, it forwards the request to the appropriate servlet and sends back the response. So features of Java Servlet. So Servlet is completely on the server side. It is inside a server and it is processed inside a server. So it handles complex tasks, that is complex or multiple client requests can be handled by a servlet because for each request a thread is created and it is parallelly processed. And next one is dynamic response. So dynamic response is nothing but based on the user input, the server or a servlet produces instant response that makes it more interactive. So it provides better performance when compared to CGI. CGI is nothing but Common Gateway Interface. So Common Gateway Interface is nothing but in CGI, for each request, a new process is created. But here, in our servlets, it uses threads within some process, within the same process. So, it handles more number of users. Servlets can handle more number of users because it is creating its own threads, not a process like CGI. So two ways to create a servlet program. So if we want to create a servlet program, initially we have to import this particular package, javax.servlet package, and we have to either by implementing the servlet interface we can use servlet, or by extending a class that implements a servlet interface we can use our servlet in our program. These are the two ways in which we can use or implement servlet in our program. Thank you.